And differentiate state and probes.
State is mutable, whereas probes are immutable. State can be used for rendering dynamic changes within the component. So we can have a component at the top, we can store the state, whereas probes are used to communicate between the components. So if we want to pass some data from component A to B, we can pass that using probes. Now, stateless components cannot have state, whereas stateless component can have probes. The major use of probes is it makes the component reusable. So if we have a button component and we pass a probe to it, let's say a variant, then by using that variant probe, we can write some custom logic inside the button component. And now whenever required, we can pass the variant name, maybe primary, secondary, and our button will look different. So that's how it makes it reusable, whereas state cannot make component reusable. State holds information about the component, whereas probes allows you to pass data from one component to another.
Okay.
So state is nothing but a unique JavaScript variable which is used to store the data of the component. State is mutable, but we cannot update state directly, because if we update state directly, so what will happen? Our state will update, but our component will not re-render. So to update the state, we have a set state method. By the way, this method is asynchronous, and we cannot use this state variable directly in our functional component. For that, we have to use state hook. So this is state, and a state is owned by its component, and it is locally scoped. That is, we cannot access state in other component. Yes, there are ways to access the state in other component, like we can pass the state using props to the other component, but that is not the recommended. That is not a remain state now. That will becomes props now. So props stand for properties. Props are nothing but the data that we pass from a parent component to child component. These are immutable, so we cannot change them in child component. And the naming convention of props is almost looks similar to the HTML tag attribute. And the main purpose of props is it makes the component reusable. So if we have a button component and we pass a props to it, let's say variant. So by using that variant prop, we can write some custom logic inside the button component, and now whenever required, we can just pass the variant name, maybe a primary or secondary, and our button will look different. So that's how it makes it reusable. So a prop drilling, let's say we have a four component A, B, C, and component D. And A is component A is parent of B, B is parent of C, and C is parent of D, like that. Okay. And now I want to pass data from component A to component D. So using props, we cannot pass data directly from A to D. So in this case, we have to pass props from a component A to B, B to C, and C to component D. So this way of passing props is known as prop drilling. And the main disadvantage of prop drilling uh, is that the components that should not be aware of that props data, like in our case component B and C, they have access to that data. So to avoid prop drilling, React provides us context API, or we can use one library we have, that is Redux, that is used for global state management. So a memoization is an optimization technique in which we store results of heavy functions in our cache and return them when we call that same function with same input. For example, take a heavy function which takes more time to execute, and this function accepts input. So to speed up this function execution, you can cache the result after executing this function, so that you can take the catch value without recomputing the value whenever you execute it again with the same inputs. So basically, using memoization, we can avoid unwanted re-renders and can optimize our React app performance. So To achieve memoization in React, in a class-based component, we have a React.pure component, and in functional component, we have a React.memo, uh, and use memo and use callback hook. So higher order component is a function which accepts a component as an argument and returns a new component with some additional feature. So with the help of higher order component, we can reuse the component logic. And also it does not modify the original component that it takes as an input. For example, we want to create two buttons but the different size or different colors. So with the help of higher order component, you can do it very easily. React Redux with Connect is also great example of higher order component. So higher order component is a function which accepts a component as an argument and returns a new component with some additional feature. So with the help of a higher order component, we can reuse the component logic, and also it does not modify the original component that it take as an input. So for example, we want to create a two button but of different size or different colors. So with the help of a higher order component, you can do it very easily. React Redux with Connect is also a good example of higher order component. So the use effect React hook is used for performing side effects in functional component like data fetching, setting up document title, or directly manipulating DOM, etc. Basically, with the help of use effect, we will inform React that our component requires something to be done after rendering of component or after the state change. This use effect hook takes two argument. The first argument is a callback function and that contain logic of side effect, and second is array of dependencies, and this hook will uh, execute this callback only when the dependency array changes. So a React router is a standard routing library which is used for building single page applications. A React router make use of component structure for calling components, and React router has some main components like a browser router, route, and link and nav link. So a browser router is talking about browser router. So router is used for router implementation that will make use of HTML5 history API for keeping UI in sync with the URL, and it is a parent component of all component. Then inside browser router we have routes. It is a newer component that is introduced in version 6. Then inside routes component we have a route component. It is and it will run only if the current URL and its path prop value is same. Then we have a link component. It is useful for creating links to various routes and implementing navigation to all over the application. It works similarly to the anchor tag. Then we have nav link. So it is almost similar to the link, but it automatically add active class name on the current nav link component. So this is a React router.
FS reps. Yeah, reps. Okay. So basically, suppose I create a input box. So I want to take the value of it. So with the help of the reps, so slash rep, we can target over there and equal to the whatever the names of first name, last name. So we will get the whatever value of that reference. We'll get to the variable. So we can utilize that value to the uh, in the code we can say, but usually we don't recommend such kind of things because of the DOM can manipulate with the help of that reference kind of the things. Got it. So what is a forward refs? Forward ref, not heard.
So using refs, we can directly access and manipulate the elements of the real DOM. Uh, and basically these refs are used for managing focus and media playback or text selection, and it is also used for integrating with third party DOM library, and also used for triggering imperative animations.
React app performance. Okay, so To improve the performance of your React app, there are a lot of techniques, but some of them is React.memo that memoizes an entire component. But if you don't want to memoize an entire component, you can use memo or use callback that are hooks uh, specifically designed to improve performance because it stores the content that it passed to it and it survives renderings. It only renders when needed. So if you just declare a variable inside your component, it will reload every time it re-renders. But if you use Mimo, it doesn't. Same thing with function. So you have use callback. Another thing that we can also mention to improve performance of React application is lazy loading, where you can load your component only when the screen is loaded or when this part of the screen is loaded, for example.
All right, cool. And in class component you have react dot pure component to improve your performance. So what it will be take, it will be we have a should component update lifecycle method. In normal component, normal class based component, it will be by default return true, but in a pure component it will checks first. So error boundaries provides us a way to catch errors that occurs in render phase. Any component which uses lifecycle methods like component did catch or get derived state from error is considered as error boundary. If we are not using error boundary, so instead of seeing an error we see a blank page, because if any error happen inside the render method, our component gets unmounted. So to display an error, we use error boundaries. Error boundary is a component which uses lifecycle method like component did catch or get derived state from error. To include error boundary, to wrap we have to wrap our app component inside our error boundary component. So now whenever error occur due to get derived state from error method, our component renders fallback UI interface instead of a blank page, and component did catch logs the error information to an error taking device tracking device. So JSX stands for JavaScript in XML. With the help of JSX, we can write HTML inside JavaScript file and place HTML in DOM without using functions like append child or create element. JSX provides syntactic sugar for React.create element. Uh, we can create a React application without using JSX as well, but that quite a lengthy process, and also React does not recommend us. So a synthetic event is an object which acts as a cross-browser wrapper around the browser's native event. It combines the behavior of different browser native events like a stop propagation and prevent default into one API. And generally we denote synthetic event object with event or e keyword. Advantages of React.js. So first of all, React uses virtual DOM, so it makes the rendering of our application very fast. And the second thing is it uses JSX, so it helps us to write HTML and JavaScript in one file without writing the functions like create element or append child. And the thing is the one-way data binding, like we can only send data from a parent component to child component. Of course there are ways to pass data from child to parent as well, but React does not recommend us. And fourth thing is with the help of React we can make a single page application. React provides us a package called a React router DOM. Using that we can. And fifth thing is that I feel if you know JavaScript, then it is very beginner friendly, and it is easy to learn and easy to use. So these are some features of React. So an element is a plain JavaScript object which describes the component state and DOM node and its desired properties. Whereas a component is a core building block of React application. It is a class or function which accepts an input and returns a React element. Only holds information about the component type, its properties, and any child element inside it. Whereas component can contain state and props and has access to the React lifecycle methods. So element is immutable, whereas component is mutable. And in element we cannot apply methods, but in components we can apply methods. So that is some difference between elements and component. So reconciliation is so basically what happens when our React application is rendered for the first time, then the tree of React element gets created and it is put into the memory, and it is in sync with the real DOM. And when any state or prop change happen, or like any updation happen, then the second copy of virtual DOM is created, and then both of these are compared with each other through a diffing algorithm, and only the updated values are sent to the first copy of the virtual DOM. Now we have to make the changes in the real DOM, and since the first copy is in the sync with the real DOM, then again both of these will be diffed, and only the updated values will be sent to the real DOM, and this process is known as reconciliation. So a Flux is not a framework or library. It's a kind of architecture that works on the view part and follow a concept of unidirection data flow model. And in this, state of store is mutable and it contains the state and change the logic. It can be have multiple store and has a single dispatcher, and all actions pass through that dispatcher. So this is Flux. So hooks are built-in JavaScript functions. By using that function, we can use the state and lifecycle methods in functional component. There are two rules which we must be followed while using React hooks. Like first is hooks must be called only at the top level of the component, and we cannot call them inside the nested functions or loops or conditions. And the second rule is that we can only call hooks from functional component. We cannot call them inside the class component. So a Redux is an open source JavaScript library which is used to manage application state, whereas a Flux is not a library or a framework. It's a kind of architecture that complements React as a view and follows the concept of unidirectional data flow model. A Redux stores state is immutable, whereas Flux state of store is mutable. In Redux, Redux store and change logic are separate, whereas in Flux, store contains state and change logic. Redux has only a single store, whereas Flux has multiple store. And Redux does not have dispatcher concept, whereas in Flux it has we have a dispatcher. Basically, it has a dispatcher, and all action pass through that dispatcher. So a React fragment is denoted by React.fragment tag, but generally we denoted them with just empty tags. And it is used when we have multiple children in render method of any component. We can wrap those child component into a single React fragment. If you don't use React fragment, then the React will throw an error that it requires a parent, because in a render method of a component we can have single elements only. So to accomplish that we can use react.fragment. What is Redux? So Redux is an open source JavaScript library with which is used to manage state of our application globally. And the good thing about Redux is that it has a very clear flow. It has a three main component: store, action, and reducer. So in store, all our application data is stored in the form of an object, and we can access the state of a store with the help of store.getState method or use selector hook, and we can update the state of a dispatching action with the help of a store.dispatch method or use dispatch hook. Then the second component we have actions. So actions are nothing but the plain JavaScript objects which contains type and a payload property. Basically, whenever a user performs some event, let's say they click on a button, then the specific action for that event is triggered, and the specific action type and payload is sent to the reducer. Then the third component we have reducer. It is a pure function which takes these actions and a previous state as an argument. Basically, it watches that specific type and action, and whenever it get the payload, it performs some logic and update the state in the store. So this is how Redux works. So useState React hook is a function which is used to create a state variables in functional component. This hook takes a initial state as an argument and returns an array of two elements. First is a state variable and second is a function. With the help of that, uh, we can update the state variable.
And functional component.
Basically, a function component are known as like a stateless component without the introduction of hooks because there were no state associated with them. Apart from this, if we talk about like utilization, if you think like once we compile the React program, uh, compiler converts the class-based component into function-based component first, then it will run. So that is the major difference. Apart from this, for class component there are lifecycle methods, but in function based component there is no lifecycle methods. We can achieve lifecycle method only with the hooks. Like these are the major difference.
Okay.
So basically, pure component is used to increase our app performance. So in class-based component, we have one method which is a should component update. So how it works, like it keeps the child component in a cache memory. Then it will compare from the previous state or props to the new state or props. And if it match, then it does not re-render the component, but if it does not match, then it will render the component. So basically it is used for increasing performance in React. But we can not use this pure component in functional component. For functional component, we have use memo and use callback hook. They acts like a pure component in functional component.
Memo and use context.
Use memo and use context, they are kind of similar. There is only one difference which I see. Use memo is used to avoid some complex calculations again and again. So if we write some logic inside the use memo and pass a dependency array to it, and next time whenever we need to calculate that data, that logic, then instead of recalculating it, use memo will return the previously computed value. So basically it memoizes the previously computed value instead of recalculating again and again, right? That's why it is because it memoizes the data. That's why it is called use memo. Whereas use callback avoids the re-rendering of the child component. How? Let's say we have a method in the parent component, and in the child component we are passing that method as a prop to the child component. Now every time your parent component re-renders, by default React creates a new instance of that callback which is passed to the child. But using use callback, this can be avoided because use callback does not let React create a new instance every time unless it is really required. So basically both of these hooks are there to perform to help React in performing well and fast.
Okay.
How to pass data from child to parent component in React?
Child to parent data passing is most of the times it is tricky, but there are ways to do it. Like we can write callback in the parent component, pass that to the child, and whenever required, we can pass the value back to the parent from child. Then we can create some ref or something. But the ideal way is to always pass the data from parent to child. Uh, Wherever it makes sense, we should lift the state up to the parent component so that we do not need to pass this data from child to parent. Redux is a state manager. It sits at the top of your application and knows a lot about your application state. Any component in the React can access the data from Redux via actions.
or reducers, or you can get a slice of any state from the Redux because it has a single store. Context API has two parts in it. One is the provider and second is the consumer. We can provide the data at the top of the application, and then any component which is a consumer can consume the data. Basically, it is used for the authentication purposes.
So can you explain what exactly context API and what is the difference between Redux and context API?
Actually, for now, I'm not using context API. I have actually for learning purpose I have used, so don't know much difference on it. But for Redux, we can achieve no, in Redux we have to make the reducer, and inside the reducer we need to pass in action any action, and in action it when we dispatch any action, it will gives us type and payload. So according to that our globally stored state will be changed, and to get the data of it, we just need to let's suppose if I'm using a class based component, so we can use connect function, that is a higher order function, and inside it we can pass map state to props and map dispatch to props. So map in map sorry state to props, so we will get the updated data as a props, and map dispatch in map dispatch I mean we can dispatch any action.
Okay, so
Middleware is like what it does is it allows us to intercept every action sent to the reducer, so that changes can be done to the action, or we can cancel the action as well. And it is also beneficial for log the error on it. So a single page application means user can navigate to different pages without even refreshing the page. So one-way data binding means data can be flow only from top level to the bottom level, or from a parent component to child component. We cannot send data from child to parent, so that is one-way data binding. So Babel is a transpiler which is used to convert the JSX into JavaScript object. It is also useful for converting ES6 JavaScript syntax into ES5 syntax, so that old version of browser can also read ES6 JavaScript.
Work with React class component, which is the old version. It's considered the old version now, and with function component with React hooks. So what's the difference between them? And if you are going to start a new project today, which one do you choose?
So it really depends. I will first answer which one I would choose, and then use that answer to
Great.
go into. So if the project does not have a lot of complicated state, if I don't have to manage a lot of complicated state, I would choose functional components. It's easier to think about. It's easier to reason about. I really like hooks. They're very easy for me to reason about. But if the project had complicated logic, if I wanted more control, I would probably pick React class components, because lifecycle hooks, not all of the lifecycle hooks have corresponding React hooks at the moment. I'm confusing words. I mean, not all of the lifecycle events that you can hook into in React components have their corresponding React hooks. So if I wanted to use Redux, for example, I would probably use class components. But the other way to think about is mixing and matching. So for example, if you have simpler components that have simpler state to manage, maybe a better approach is to just write a functional component for that. And other components that require more control, more granular control, because you get those lifecycle hooks, it's probably a good idea to use class components.
Great answer. And this is the kind of answer that I like. Just wanna mention that. So you give me a complete answer. This make total difference. Well, when I look to you, I know that I can trust you. If I ask you something, if you give me...
So a key is a special string attribute that we need to include when we render list of elements. With the help of key, React can identify that which elements were added, changed, or removed from the list. and keys are generally used for displaying a list of data is coming from API. And if we not use keys, so React will not able to understand or order or uniqueness of each element in the list. Yes, I have one question. So if I get selected, so what type of project I will be working on, and what will be my roles and responsibilities?
Purpose. Yeah.
Okay. So, do you have any idea about lazy loading? How it's work?
Yeah. So basically, okay, instead of adding that slash slash directly, we if we are doing that slash and path, we are passing whatever component we have using inside the React. So at that time, what happens? So whatever route we have written to the inside the routes, so it will get bundled inside the single time. And if we use dot then, so it will be loaded at the lazy. So it will be not going to load inside the DOM as a bundle get created. So it will be having the lazily loaded with the dot then. So we can say the promise based such kind of things we do use for the lazy.
Okay. Right. So basically, for the utilization, right?
Yeah.
You can say for the performance perspective, you can use that.
Yes, on
To
demand.
use context is a hook, it is used for state management purpose. Like we can create a context using create context hook, and then we can use that using use context hook, and it is an alternative of use state hook. Using this, we can avoid prop drilling as well, and we can manage our state globally using use context hook. So in control component, data of form element is handled by reps or DOM, but in uncontrolled component, this data is handled by React states. So the difference between React and Angular is on the basis of architecture. React is only the view part of MVC, that is model, view, and controller, while Angular is complete framework for MVC. And talking about the rendering, so React supports server side rendering while Angular supports client side rendering. And talking about DOM, that is a data object model, so React uses virtual DOM and Angular uses real DOM. And talking about data binding, so React uses one-way data binding or unidirectional data flow, while Angular have two-way data binding or bidirectional data flow. And talking about debugging, so React supports compile time debugging while Angular supports runtime debugging. And talking about author, so React is owned by Facebook while the author of Angular is Google. So every component in React, it has a life cycle which we can monitor and manipulate during its three main phases. First is the mounting phase, second is updating phase, and third is unmounting phase. So in mounting phase, the element get pushed into the DOM, and during this phase, four of the built-in method gets called. That is the constructor method, which is used to set the initial value of the state. Then second is static get derived state from props. Uh, in this lifecycle method, we change the value of the state based on the props that component, and it is also called just before rendering of our application. Then third is a render method, which which renders the HTML to the DOM, and this method is essential lifecycle method, while others are optional. And fourth is component did mount. This is the last method of mounting phase and calls after our application is rendered. And this lifecycle method is used to perform some side effects, like if you want to fetch some data uh, from the server, or if you want to implement the timer functionalities, then we can use this component did mount. Then after this, component goes into the updating phase, and our component goes in updating phase only when their state or prop changes. And during this phase, five lifecycle method gets called. First is get derived state from props. Second is should component update. Basically, it returns us a boolean value, and by default, its value is true. Like the component we will be updated again and again. But if you don't want to like stop the render the same component again and again, if previous prop or current props are same, then we can return false from here. Like for example, we use this in a pure component. Then third is a render method. This method will call again and re-render the HTML to the DOM with the new changes. And fourth is get snapshot before update. This method gets called just before changes in virtual DOM have to be reflected in the real DOM. With the help of this method, we can have access to previously present state as well as props. And fifth is component did update. It is again used to perform some side effects in our application. Then final phase is unmounting phase. In this phase, HTML gets our HTML element, or we can say our component is removed from the DOM. During this phase, only one lifecycle method gets called, that is component will unmount, and this method is called just before unmounting of the component. And generally in this method we perform the cleanup of our code, like we can remove subscription, or we can remove the event listeners, and we can cancel the network request calls, like that. And if you not do this, so it will be cause a memory leak error in our program.